Hello everybody, my name is Zalem and welcome to Five Nights at Freddy's, an indie horror game that has gone into history as one of the most popular and well-known horror game franchises. This game has to be one of the most influential horror games of the modern age, essentially inventing the sit and survive genre and spawning countless sequels, spin-offs, fan games, and loosely inspired games. This game was the catalyst to what we now know as the FNaF franchise, consisting of some 11 games and some 18 books altogether, not to mention a film that is presumably still on the way. Now, I'm going to assume that everyone here at least knows what Five Nights at Freddy's is, so I won't explain any of the core concepts here. I am, however, going to guess that not everyone watching this video knows everything there is to know about the lore of these games, which I don't blame you. Between hidden minigames and the significance of how many toes each animatronic has, the lore is spread far and wide. I have therefore linked an incredibly in-depth video by Wendigoon. He is an amazing YouTuber with great storytelling skills and great knowledge of everything FNaF. You should be able to find the video in the description down below and in the iCard in the top right corner of your screen. I'd recommend watching it if you're interested in learning more about the story of FNaF, but it's not entirely required in order to understand the rest of this video. This theory/analysis will also mostly be in response to MatPat's latest FNaF theory video. So in case you bothered not to watch the Wendigoon video, I do highly recommend watching the Game Theorist video, which I have also linked in the description and in the iCard. Assuming that everyone that wanted to has had a chance to watch these videos they deemed relevant, we can get started with the actual video. For those that didn't watch it, in this latest FNaF video, MatPat discusses the latest entry in the Five Nights at Freddy's Tales from the Pizza Plex book series, in which there is a story telling how an indie developer was hired by Fredbear Entertainment in order to create a set of games which were to make light of the controversies and tragedies that occurred at their restaurants decades ago. I say hired since he was essentially manipulated into helping Fredbear Entertainment through the use of illusions, but that's not terribly relevant to the rest of this video. This story heavily implies that the first four FNaF games that we know and love are also games in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe itself, and that they were made by a mentally decaying indie game developer. As MatPat points out, this means that now we have absolutely no way to know which parts of these first four games are actual canon and which parts were made up by this indie developer. MatPat went out of his way to iterate that everything in those first four games is now subject to skepticism, and that it is now up to the fanbase to separate canon from non-canon. I believe MatPat was very quick to dismiss most things that happened in the first four games by going as far as to state that Golden Freddy, the staple character of the first couple games, isn't a real character, since according to him there is no substantial proof of either him or Fredbear ever existing in the franchise. We can't claim he ever existed. And if someone is trying to take away our jolly golden bear, then I will have to step in and save him. You see, MatPat very briefly mentioned Golden Freddy's inclusion in Ultimate Custom Night, which, as you might remember, is still very much canon, and wrote Golden Freddy's appearance thereof as a simple torment method used by Cassidy, or the one you should not have killed. I disagree, however, since there is a pretty cool Easter egg in that game which tells me that Fredbear and thereby Golden Freddy is very much real. You need to set all animatronics in that game to level 0 and Golden Freddy to level 1. Then you need to collect 10 coins and buy and use the death coin once Golden Freddy spawns in the office. By doing so, you would get jump scared by Fredbear himself, purple hat and bow tie included. Now, we know that Scott never does anything without reason, especially when it comes to Easter eggs, and seeing as how it is safe to assume that Scott knew the story he wanted to tell by this point, I think it is safe to say that this solidifies the idea that Fredbear, and then by extension, Golden Freddy is real. Okay, now I do know that was quite the tangent, but I do think it was good that we got that out of the way right off the bat, since Ultimate Custom Night also tells us a lot about all of the other characters in this franchise. By listening to the animatronics' voice lines, we know that a lot of the things that we learned about them in their respective games, the first four games included, are still applicable even after Scott revoked the first game's canonicity. There is a lot of lore in Ultimate Custom Night, which still provides a solid foundation and a lot of proof for most of the widely accepted theories in the community. Now, I do think it would be a good idea that we really look at these first four games and define exactly what we still know to be true from them. The first two games are the easiest in my opinion. We know that the indie developer, Steve Snodgrass, was tasked with creating horror games that were to make light of the actual tragedies which spoiled the Fazbear name. Steve then creates these games based on real information and his own deranged inputs. Based on this, we can divide the things we see in these games into two different groups: parts of the games that reflect the real events, and parts of the games that were thought up by Steve. I believe that it is safe to say that the missing children's accident was a real event. The animatronics we see in the first game are also real characters due to their inclusion in Ultimate Custom Night and Security Breach. It makes sense that the tragedy Fazbear Entertainment would want to cover up would be that of 5 children going missing somewhere during their visit to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Everything else, the haunted animatronics, the phone guy, and most importantly, the actual life events of the game could all very well not be true. The second game works in roughly the same way. I think that the bite of 87 was a real thing that happened because there has to be something worth covering up. Otherwise, what would be the point? The animatronics that we see in-game are once again very much the real animatronics that pizzeria would have had. Whether or not the withered animatronics would have also been there is up for debate, since we can't say anything concrete about them. Everything else is once again up for speculation, such as the inclusion of the shadow animatronics and actual events we see transpire whilst the player plays the game. One thing I do think is important to note about this game and the first is that this means we don't actually know whether or not these animatronics were really hostile. We've always assumed that the animatronics have a constant need for security guard blood, but it could be a lot more nuanced than that. It's not that important, but I do think it is interesting to take into consideration. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 is the most interesting game in light of these new revelations in my opinion. I find this game's inclusion quite odd, since there's no real controversy surrounding anything we see or hear in this game, except for the fact that Fazbear Frights burns down at the end of the game, which doesn't sound like a real tragedy to me. What's weirder is the fact that this game features Springtrap, who we know is an actual character due to his inclusion in Pizzeria Simulator and Security Breach, even though he isn't quite the same in that game, but I digress. So I would like to raise two questions for you to solve. Why make this game? What is there to cover up? And how could Steve have known about Springtrap? Springtrap wasn't publicly known except for the 4 or so days that he was on display at Fazbear Frights. That is, of course, assuming that he was really only there for 4 days. It could very well be that Fazbear Frights was open for a whole lot longer, making Springtrap a slightly more well-known character. Still, what was so special about him that warranted Steve to make a game about him? I would assume that Fazbear Entertainment didn't know about Springtrap's real nature, because why would they put up a rotting corpse as an attraction? There is a lot about this game that I don't fully understand with these new revelations, but that isn't all too important anyways, since there are some serious implications here now that completely change the way we should look at this franchise's story, but I'll get to that later. We'll just move on to the next game in the series for now. FNaF 4 has a bit more straightforward of a narrative in my opinion. There is a high likelihood that the bite of 83 really did happen. As messed up as it is, it would make sense that Fazbear Entertainment would want to cover up an incident where a child was bitten by their main star who later passed away due to the injuries he sustained during said incident. I do therefore think that this bite did happen, whilst pretty much everything else can be seen as non-canon. Maybe with the exception for the minigames we see between the nights, since that narrative could have been constructed through public information and witness accounts, even though those events could have easily been exaggerated. One more interesting thing is the inclusion of Plushtrap, seeing as how he is clearly inspired by Springtrap. But seeing as how those plushies are a canon thing due to another story from the previous book series, that could explain Plushtrap's inclusion here. But there is nothing substantial to say about this game's lore other than that. There is, however, something interesting that Ennard Knight from Sister Location brings to the table. By entering the code 1983 into the keypad during that night, we see cameras set up in the exact house we play in FNaF 4. Seeing as how Sister Location is still very much canon, it begs the question of how it relates to the in-universe game of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. You could raise the fact that the canonicity of Ennard Knight is also up in the air, but since we can also see a layout of the house from FNaF 4 during the break and repair section of that game, I would argue that there is still something worth discussing here, although I won't do that in this video. Now that we have worked our way through the first 4 games, it is time to discuss what all of this means in the grand scheme of things. Not much. That is the honest answer. I think I understand why Scott has decided to retcon these first 4 games the way he did, and it is because he hasn't retconned anything. Not really. Let me take you back to Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted. During the opening narration of that game, we are told that the games that we have played before were created by a complete lunatic and were only loosely based on actual events. The events which we discussed earlier.
We know that Fazbear Entertainment has developed something of a bad reputation over the last few decades, and while it's true that some stories associated with our name were loosely based on actual events, the majority of them were total fabrications from the mind of a complete lunatic. Lawsuits pending.
Later on in the game, if you gather enough of the secret tapes, you learn that this nameless indie game developer was hired by Fazbear Entertainment in order to make light of the tragedies that transpired decades ago. This is the exact same story that the latest installment in the Tales from the Pizzaplex book series also presents. These moments in Help Wanted created a lot of discord amongst the fanbase, and especially amongst the theorist side of it. On the one hand, people realized that it was probably of some importance, but no one really knew how or why. How was this plot point relevant to the rest of the story? Did Scott just soft reboot the series, or was it all one big elaborate troll? I think most people found it to be too hard to really do anything with this new information, so most people elected to ignore it and move on and keep theorizing the same way they had been before. But that was clearly the wrong move, seeing as how Scott made sure to reiterate the indie developer plot point. But why? What would be the point in retconning his story? Well, he hasn't retconned the story. I think I understand why Scott has decided to throw the first 4 games into the abyss of uncertainty, and it makes a lot of sense when you consider the history of FNAF's story. I think everyone here would agree when I say that Scott didn't have some grand overarching story in mind, seeing as how FNAF 1 was supposed to be his last game ever. It turned out that wasn't his last game, as he made FNAF 2, where he expanded the story with new animatronics and a mysterious purple figure who was heavily implied to be the killer of the missing children. FNAF 3 then explored that character further by turning him into Springtrap and creating a deeper story through the hidden minigames you can find and play in that game. FNAF 3 was also the first game to have a bad and good ending, which also expanded upon the questions and lore. FNAF 4 was very much intended to be the final game in the franchise, mainly focusing on wrapping everything up nicely. FNAF 4 was made with the core intention of linking the previous games together and finally providing some answers. Scott once said in a message that there is a solution to the story, all of the pieces that he had laid out finally put together. The most prominent theory, which I do believe was Scott's intended solution, is Dream Theory, which states that everything was a dream dreamt by the crying child we see in FNAF 4 on his deathbed. Scott also stated that he thought many people wouldn't accept the story the way he had intended it, saying, "It was all a dream," is a relatively easy way out. But I do think it is justified, seeing as how Scott most likely didn't have a story in mind until the 3rd game. After FNAF 4, he continued, however, which was probably because the FNAF community had grown to such an impressive scale, and he knew no one was ready for the series to be over. But the story didn't work anymore, and he tried adjusting it and shifting it so the previous installments would work with his newfound intentions. But the story got so big and convoluted there was hardly a way forward after Ultimate Custom Night. And this is why I believe he tried pushing the idea that the first 4 games were made by an in-universe character in Help Wanted. By doing this, he could indirectly tell his audience that things said in the earliest installments might not be completely true. But people didn't pick up on this, however. So now he's trying it again with his latest book. The point here is hardly to retcon everything, but it is to tell people that certain aspects from those first games just don't fit into the story anymore. Take the Happiest Day minigame and the good and bad endings from FNAF 3, for example. I personally don't think those things work in Scott's new story anymore. But theorists all over the community, including MatPat, are still taking things like this as gospel, which just isn't the way to go. I wholeheartedly believe Scott wants the community to primarily look at clues from the newer games and stop focusing on all of the minute clues from the older games so that we can piece together the current story. Again, this doesn't mean nothing from those games is canon. I actually believe most of it is still very much canon. It's just those little things that we should move on from. All in all, I don't think these new developments are as massively disastrous as some people like MatPat think. It shouldn't change the way we look at this franchise and its story and characters, but I do think this is a wake-up call for all of the theorists in the fandom. In order to figure out the story that Scott wants to tell with his games and books, we need to start focusing more on the newer facts and lore hints, and start disregarding specific lore hints from older games which clearly point towards old and currently irrelevant stories that Scott might very well have intended before, but that he doesn't want to tell anymore. With a franchise as big and popular as FNaF, and with a story as convoluted and shrouded in mystery as that of FNaF, it is no wonder that a storyteller such as Scott would want to alter his story in such a way that it leads to an end product he can be proud of. But maybe this wasn't the best way to let his audience know that he doesn't agree with the canonicity of older clues anymore, but it can't be easy to find a way to do so without breaking the immersion too much. Are there some inconsistencies between the older and newer games now? Yes, there are, but I think we can overlook a lot of that and just focus on the larger narratives the older games provide. Will this kill the theorist side of the community? What? No, of course not. They're resilient, so I think they'll manage. I highly doubt any of them will be happy with this approach, as much as I think it is the way to go about it. But what I can say, the pieces are all there for the answers to be found, but will the fans and the theorists accept it that way? Before signing off officially, I do quickly want to note that this video is not supposed to be a jab at MatPat or any of his theories. I think MatPat is an amazing YouTuber and an amazing theorist in every regard, not just FNaF, but everything. It's just that I do think that, he kind of went off the rails with this last one a bit, so I'm just here to reel him back in a bit and get him back on the path. I mean, it's not just to MatPat, it's to all the theorists out there. The games are changing, the story is changing, Scott's view of the games and the story is changing, and our theories and our perspectives need to change with Scott and his intentions. Otherwise we'll get left in the dust and in the dark, and we'll have no clue as to what's going on because we're just constantly stuck looking at old clues that don't have any relevance anymore. This is a thank you to those of you that managed to make it to the end of the video. I know that this type of video is very different from what you might be used to from me, in case you're used to anything. Seeing my non-existent uploads these last few months, motivation can be hard to come by. What can I say? All in all, I do hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I really enjoyed making and writing it because I hold FNaF very close to my heart. Hopefully, watching this, I would assume that you like FNaF too, to some extent. Well, with that all said, mind you, this final section is not scripted, so it's kind of all over the place, but credits and whatnot. I really hope you have a blessed day and see you soon. Maybe.